Thank you, Grace. Thanks for having me at this session. You have to excuse me, I'm a little congested, so I sound a little stuffy here. I just wanted to mention that NIH has a long-standing policy that the data and products that are generated from the research we fund, we expect them to be shared in a timely fashion. But we do have a long culture of data sharing, not only going back to 1999, I just started here in this figure, but we have several policies that promote the sharing of research data, tools, and products, including the Research Tools Policy in 1999, our 2003 NIH Data Sharing Policy, which applies to awards that are granted and greater than $500K in direct costs in any 1 year. We have several policies that promote the sharing of genomic data sharing and other activities and initiatives that also promote data sharing, such as the Big Data to Knowledge Initiative and several White House and federal initiatives promoting open access and increasing access to publications and data. More recently, we have the All of Us Research program. We have the sharing of results from clinical trials, as well as other initiatives such as the NIH Commons Pilot Project. I just wanted to mention in February of 2015, NIH released its plan to increase access to publications and scientific data. We already have a public access policy, which you all are aware of, so we didn't really need to do anything in response to that. But as far as our data was concerned, we needed to consider how we could require data sharing. We already have some policies in place in which we're encouraging or expecting data to be shared, but how can we move forward and make this policy a little bit more stringent? How can we require and evaluate data management and sharing to all of us or plans that would be coming in, as well as encouraging the use of existing repositories and standards and promoting the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which I think probably almost all of us are probably mentioning in our talks today. But in developing a plan, it was important for us to remember that a plan does not equal a policy. A plan is just a plan, and this basically just states this is what we're interested in, this is what we're considering, these are the directions that we're moving. But because NIH funds such a vast amount in different types of research, we need to be very careful in how we move forward. So we feel that it's definitely important for us to establish our priorities in data sharing before moving forward with any policy. So at the end of 2016, we released a request for information on strategies for NIH data management, sharing, and citation. This request for information was divided up into sections, the first of which was data sharing strategy development, where we really wanted to capture the what, when, whys, and hows of data sharing, how it should be managed and shared, what are the value in sharing different types of data, what are the barriers and challenges, and how can they be overcome. Section 2 included questions or topics related to the inclusion of data and software citation in NIH reporting mechanisms. What is the impact of citation on reporting, and how can we strengthen and incentivize data and software sharing? We also asked for general feedback. We had this request for information out for about 45 days. We didn't receive a large number of comments, but the comments we did receive have been very helpful. And this is a brief analysis of the public comments. We asked the respondents to self-report their own demographics. Most were from university setting. There were some that were from nonprofit, non-governmental settings and so forth. We did receive quite a number of comments from librarians, publishers, editors, and that's in the other category represented here. Most of the respondents were scientific researchers, and most were clinical data sharing, or what was considered here as other data sharing. We did receive a large number of respondents from scientists in one specific scientific discipline, and so they're represented in that other category. And a lot of the respondents were performing research involving human subjects or data generated from human specimens and samples. So just to give you a brief summary of the public comments, the respondents generally were supportive of data sharing, and they felt that data underlying or supporting a publication, a dissertation, or supplemental materials and that any data or metadata that's needed to actually replicate a study would be the most valuable to share. So they did not necessarily feel that only data underlying a publication is needed, because there are some data that, or there are some studies that are not published, but the data is still valuable to share. That data should be made available for secondary research purposes for a minimum of 10 years, and this it happens to be standard in some communities. That establishing a culture of sharing would incentivize and encourage data sharing. In our second section on the inclusion of data and software citation, the respondents felt that increased reporting of data and software through citations, that is, through like a unique persistent identifier, would be very helpful as long as it was used as a means to incentivize researchers to share data, and thus enabling appropriate credit or attribution for their work. And that promoting the importance of versioning data sets and software when generating citations is very, very important, because as you know, data sets may change over time, and depending on the type of study that it is, you may have some increased follow-up and additional data being added in. Respondents also felt that NIH should discourage the use of proprietary software for uploaded or shared data, because that would then not allow those products to be freely used, and that we should consider including the individual's appropriate expertise in the peer review process if we're going to end up evaluating data management and sharing plans. So in looking at all this feedback and having some internal deliberations, we're trying to figure out how to move forward on this. Do we need a new policy? Do we need to update our 2003 data sharing policy? Our actual compliance with the 2003 data sharing policy hasn't been that great. It's only been in the realm of about 12%. And that's because there are no certain or specific requirements or elements, consistent elements for data sharing plans are expected to come in. They're not evaluated, and it's very hard for program staff to follow up with this. And so we're trying to determine what can we do to give a greater stick and carrot for this type of policy. We're considering what the definition is of scientific data. We know what the community suggested through the request for information, but because we're dealing with so many different scientific disciplines, it's actually very hard for us to come up with a definition of scientific data that's general enough to apply to everybody, but not too prescriptive. What the scope and applicability of a policy would be, as well as how can we encompass existing data sharing policies into this overarching policy. So we're looking at some potential provisions for new data sharing policy, one of which are data management and sharing plans. Should we require these to come in with applications? Should we require certain elements to be addressed, such as timelines, data types, standards to be used, persistent identifiers and things like that, sustainability, how long would the data be preserved and managed? But we want to also promote consistency with the FAIR principles, because we do believe that whatever and wherever people put their data, it should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We're trying to determine whether and how to evaluate data management and sharing plans. Currently, data management and sharing plans that come in may be commented on, but they're finalized and approved by the program officer working with the investigator. Should these be evaluated during the peer review process and factored in somehow into the score? And would that be something feasible that we can do? We're also looking at the format and availability of data management and sharing plans. Should we allow these to come in a structured format, such as a machine-readable format? Should they be publicly available, much like an abstract? Would that really have investigators to think about how they're wording and providing information in their data management and sharing plans? And we're also looking into our ability to require data sharing if it's appropriate and consistent with the proposed research, or if it's consistent with informed consent of the study participants, for example. For example, we now have the authority through the 21st Century Cures Act to require data sharing. So we're trying to see if we can put all of this in a new policy moving forward. We're also looking into resources. We don't want to necessarily encourage or have investigators to submit their data to just NIH repositories. We would prefer to encourage investigators to put their data wherever the norm is for that type of data in existing repositories, and allowing for budgeting for data management and sharing in grant applications. One other aspect of all of this, of course, is compliance and enforcement. It's very easy to do that during the award period, but if data is not generated till later in the research funding, how can we ensure that the data management and sharing plans are being complied with? So all in all, we can come up with a policy, but that doesn't necessarily equal implementation, and all the devil is in the details. We also have a lot of other activities that are ongoing related to data sharing. We held a workshop last fall on the value of data sharing, and this was a combined workshop in conjunction with NSF, the Science of Science Innovation Policy. We have a policy on the reporting of preprint and other research products. We also have a Data Commons pilot consortium project, which is started not too long ago. The premise of this is to develop an infrastructure using cloud-based platforms to allow for the sharing of data, promoting the use of the FAIR principles. This is really in the pilot project stages, and the group is currently developing infrastructure and also determining the feasibility and access to data. 3 data sets are being piloted right now: the NHLBI TopMed data set, the GTEx data set, and a model organisms data sets. The White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy also has an interagency working group on open science, which is co-chaired by NIH and NSF. This group meets weekly. There are about 22 other federal agencies represented. The group is trying to determine what the goals and objectives are for open science and coming up with some recommendations for the nation as to how we can foster open science. And the group also discusses and shares experiences and projects that are ongoing to see how we can work together to move forward. Even more recently is the NIH Strategic Plan for Data Science. This plan was requested by Congress and was actually submitted to Congress not too long ago. But through this strategic plan, NIH will modernize data resource ecosystem, increase utility for researchers, enhance data sharing, access, and interoperability, as well as modernize infrastructure and increase capacity. And the policy aspect of this is the last element, which is to enact appropriate policies to promote stewardship and sustainability. So these activities are ongoing with some of the other policy efforts at NIH. The U.S. National Library of Medicine has also released its strategic plan from 2017 to 2027, and there are 3 basic bends to the strategic plan. The first is to accelerate discovery and advance health through data-driven research. The second is to reach more people in more ways through enhanced dissemination and engagement. And third is to build a workforce for data-driven research and health. So in all of these activities, there have been many discussions and deliberations related to data sharing. And one of the primary, of course, challenges is a culture change, but there are a lot of other challenges which we've outlined on this slide. Time and effort. We need to determine which data to preserve and for how long. It may be that maybe some data is important to share initially and maybe it's not useful over time. Cleaning data, putting it in an accessible format, providing metadata, and also there's somewhat limited training in data management and sharing. There are infrastructure challenges. A lot of investigators do not know which resources are available for them to share their data through, as well as the sustainability of those resources and the long-term preservation of them. There are procedures for providing data access that can also be a challenge. Sometimes it's easier for investigators to put their data in one repository and let that repository deal with the distribution of it. There are human resource challenges. There are policy coordination challenges. You heard Grace mention some of the work that they are doing with RDA in coordinating policies or identifying what the publisher and funder policies are. Lack of rewards and incentives. Some investigators don't want to share data if they're not going to get credit for that sharing. It's a little different than a publication, but how can citations be used for investigators to receive credit for their sharing. We have to consider all the ethical, legal, and social implications of sharing for human participant data, especially with regards to privacy and trust. There are proprietary interests. You heard Grace mention some of the licensing challenges, but we also know that researchers want access to their data. They want to be the first ones to publish on it and analyze it. And sometimes institutions or individuals want to protect their competitive advantage. And there are also compliance and enforcement issues, as I mentioned earlier, especially after the award period has ended. So, does NIH need a new policy for data management sharing? We need to get there. We need to determine what the valuable data is or are. We need to determine how we can incentivize data management sharing. We also recognize that a policy does not equal implementation. We can come out with a very general policy for people to respond to, but we know that implementing this policy requires quite a bit, and there are a lot of details there that have to be worked out. We want to be able to coordinate with other data and open science related activities, not just within the NIH, but other funders, publishers, institutions, as well as other agencies. And we want to maximize the value of information that we gather from our outreach and engagement activities. And here's just a list of some additional resources for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina. Jörg, I'm just going to get your presentation up if you'd like to come on.